everybody. Hi, there's like 3 people in tonight. Hello. My name is Charlotte, as Duncan just said, and I am on the young adults team here at the Well, and I lead one of the communities here. Also, a few people from my community. By day, I work for a charity called Girls Brigade Ministries, and we are an international mission movement that try to work in the lives of girls and young women to improve their lives, strengthen their skills, and most importantly, introduce them to Jesus. So I have quite a cool job as well. But I'm really grateful to be here sharing with you this evening. As Duncan said, over the last few weeks, we've been thinking about what it means to be an emotionally healthy church. And we've looked at dealing with emotional pain and also how we break free from anxiety. But tonight, what we're going to be thinking about together is living authentically. Living authentically. And we're going to do that by looking at the topic of authenticity through 4 different questions this evening. So we're going to think about, what does the world say it is? What does the Bible say it is? What does life look like without it? And what does life look like with it? Does that sound okay to everybody? Great, because that's what I'm going to go with. Wonderful. So what does the world say that authenticity is? Now, the word authentic seems to be a bit of a buzzword these days. There are I looked this up especially this week, there are over 9.5 million posts on Instagram with hashtag authentic. I don't know if any of you have put up a hashtag authentic post on Instagram before, but you're one of 9.5 million if you have. And people want to be authentic, it's a buzzword. Brands are told that they should be authentic. And there just seems to be a craving within my generation and within society as a whole for that which is real. Because we don't want fake, we don't want spin, we want it real. We want authenticity. And society is increasingly obsessed with this quest for authenticity, for the authentic, and with the idea of what is fake and what is real. And it's all-consuming. We see it on TV, we see it on social media, we have it in our conversations with our friends, and no doubt in our own subconscious as well, this quest for the authentic. And so here are some examples of that quest for authenticity in society. Never mind, I'm going to tell you about them anyway. Celebrities are lambasted. They may come up on the slides, they may not. But celebrities are lambasted. There are pictures, here we go, that you get in these magazines. Is this their face? Is this not their face? Did they have cosmetic surgery? Did they not? We have reality TV shows like Love Island and Netflix's new Dating Around, if anyone has seen that one. Yeah, getting Love Island into a sermon, classic. But they are reality TV shows, and they have real people, but in manufactured settings. And in Love Island's case, they have games where they kind of try to introduce things into the conversation. So he said, she said, and prods from the producers to introduce tension and drama for the entertainment of the viewer. We have Facebook. Who's on Facebook? A few people, yes. Social media and other social media, supposedly a place where we connect with our friends, but increasingly these days a place where we're just bombarded with advertisements. And today there seems to be this new kind of advertisement where there used to be adverts on one side, friendships in the middle. Now our friends are ambassadors for products. And so we have this new kind of advertising that's masked as something that's authentic, and they try to sell to you in that way. The TV show Catfish, if anyone's seen this, I love Catfish, which helps people find the person that they've only previously spoken to online. That's the premise of the show. And to find out, basically, whether they are who they say they are. They have no idea at the beginning of the show, is this person real or not? Brands are encouraged to be authentic. That's how they're told they can reach consumers. And yet this gets taken to the point of being meaningless. I saw this advert and I thought, what does this even mean? I am a sister, I am a runner, I am authentic, I do hot yoga. What on earth are they trying to sell? Who knows? It's meaningless. That's what it gets taken to the point of. We increasingly hear phrases, don't we, like post-truth politics and fake news. Politicians, journalists, and other leaders try to appeal to our emotions, to stir us up, to vote, and to take action, but they ignore or cleverly reword the facts as if truth is suddenly of secondary importance. And I love this example. I don't know if you'll have heard of this before, but this is now closed, and this was in Japan, and it was called the Ocean Dome, and it was located in Miyazaki. And it was one of the world's largest indoor water parks. It was 300 meters long and 100 meters wide. And at its peak, it received 1.25 million visitors a year. And they were attracted to, as you can see in the picture, if you can see on any of the screens, but the flawless artificial sand and skyline, the simulated waves, and the constant air and sea temperature that were closely monitored and closely maintained. And it even had a retractable roof, so that on a rainy day, you could still experience the sun and the sand and the blue skies. And it sounds great, doesn't it? When I read about it, I thought, gosh, that sounds idyllic. And then I found out that the actual beach, if you go to the next one, was only 300 meters away. Amazing. And finally, the explosion of social media encourages celebrities to share more of themselves with us, doesn't it? To be authentic and to bear their personal lives online. But so often, the accounts of celebrities are just like these beautifully curated highlight reels of their lives, because they choose what they do and they don't want to share with us. And brands, and they give them products and they pay them to advertise their products. And so the behind-the-scenes approach of celebrities on social media doesn't seem so authentic after all. And maybe you could think of some examples too of society's quest for the authentic. What about in our own lives? If we were going to rephrase what people mean when they talk about being authentic, when they talk about that and talk about it about themselves, we might go with something like being true to yourself. Authentic, being true to yourself. Carl Rogers, if any of you have heard of him, he was a 20th century psychotherapist and psychologist, and he defined authenticity as being the author of one's own life. And to him, it meant being aware of and able to express your own needs whilst balancing that with the needs of other people. And so being yourself and living a life that was true to yourself was his definition of what it means to be happy and what it means to be authentic. And that seems to be quite a common rhetoric in 21st century society, doesn't it? Be true to yourself, and that's authentic, and that's how you get happiness. And that has a little bit of grounding. So are you ready to get a little bit geeky this evening? Because I looked up the word root of authentic. How exciting, my spare time. And the word authentic comes from the Latin authenticus, around 1300 to 1350. And authenticus means coming from the author, an original. Now, our modern definition of authentic as something that is genuine didn't fully develop until about the late 18th century. And so if you can see, it's a bit small on here, but even in the mid-14th century, the word authentic meant authoritative, something that carried authority. And so authentic, when we look at the where this word has come from, actually means something that has the authority of its author. And that's what people often mean today, isn't it? An Instagram photo with #authentic is normally somebody talking about being true to themselves, being the author of their own lives. And I wonder, is that what authentic means in your life? Is authentic being true to myself and saying what I think, regardless of how that might impact other people? Because at least I'm being true to myself. Is authentic posting a no makeup selfie on social media? Or is authentic something more than all of this? Is it more than just being true to myself? What does the Bible say authentic means? What does it mean to live authentically according to the Bible? Just before we look at a passage to help us think about this evening, I wanted to give you a little bit of context to set the scene, as it were. And so what we're going to look at tonight is a passage from a letter that a guy called Paul wrote, and it's called 2 Corinthians. And Paul was a guy who lived in the 1st century, so he came after Jesus, and he wrote much of the New Testament that we have in the Bible. And he was originally a rather authoritarian Jew, so he persecuted the early Christians and the early followers of Jesus until he had an incredible encounter with God. And Paul became a follower of Jesus himself. And he's known today as the Apostle Paul because he went on to tell a huge number of people about Jesus. He planted churches in Asia Minor and Europe, and he traveled and supported those churches, and he wrote letters to them. And in the New Testament, 13 of the 27 books are traditionally attributed to Paul. They're letters that he wrote to those churches that he planted. And one of the churches that he planted was in a city called Corinth. And the Roman writer Strabo described Corinth as always great and wealthy. And a theologian today describes it as a metropolitan boom town. That was the kind of place that Corinth was. And it had a population of 750,000. And if you can see the map, it was in a really unique geographical position. So it was on an isthmus, I think is how you say it, not sure. But basically it means that it was a crossroads. So it was a crossroad for trade, so they could have the land trade and they could have the sea trade. So there were always people and always money running through this city, Corinth. And the Christians in this church in Corinth that Paul writes to were largely middle class. Yes, there were some that were poor, there were some slaves, and there were even some of higher society. But the majority of these Christians that Paul is writing to are middle class, and they were literate, and they were city dwellers. And of Corinth generally, this city that Paul was writing to, modern theologian Michael B. Thompson says, the values of the Corinthians sound surprisingly contemporary. The freedmen competed with each other for market share and for attention in the pursuit of upward mobility. In the absence of nobility or aristocracy because of the city's youth, power and recognition did not come through inheritance, but by self-assertion and by flaunting one's money. Individualism and image marked Corinthian society. Does that sound at all familiar as a society today? People use their wealth to advertise their virtue and to build their reputation in a competition for honor. Corinth's citizens were famous for their proud boasting. The florid style of Corinthian columns in architecture is a lasting testimony to their fascination with self-display. To the Corinthians, notions of service was servile. What they sought in religion was eloquence, entertainment, and dramatic displays of power, not transformation and a life changed. And Paul had, that's like my mum sneezing in the middle of, brilliant, thanks mum. And into this context, Paul had planted a church, and he writes to this church in between his second and his third visits there. And this is the reason that he wrote to them, because he had heard word from Corinth that these new ministers or these new apostles had suddenly arrived, and they were teaching the Corinthian Christians things. They were saying that actually Paul's theology, this guy who established this church, his teaching, his theology is false. And as a result, the church began to believe a whole host of things against Paul. And he alludes to some of them in his letter, so we can get a sense of what they were saying against him. But the list of the things they were saying is huge. They accused him of lacking inner strength. They said, you're an imposter. They said, you are a fool. You might even be mad. And they said, you just lack mystical powers. You don't have any miracles. Can we even trust your ministry? Because these new people, what they're coming and doing is way better than what I've seen you do. Now, I wonder, if you had received words like this, I wonder what your response would be to the Corinthian church, if these were some of the things they were throwing against you. And if Paul was going to be authentic, so as society defines it, being true to himself, I wonder how you might expect him to respond to this. He might say any number of things. He might say, excuse me, but didn't you hear about how I've traveled from church to church and place to place, and every church that I've strengthened has grown in numbers daily? Or he might have said, oh, do you think these ministers are performing some great signs and wonders? Yeah, when I was in Macedonia the other year, actually I cast a spirit out of a slave girl. That was quite impressive. So I'm going to come back and show you even more signs and wonders than you've seen. Or he might have just thought, you know what, there's always going to be people that hate. And so I'm just going to ignore and I'm going to move on and I'm going to continue. Well, let's look at how he actually responded, shall we? I'd love you, if you can, to get hold of a Bible. There's some on your pews, and you might have brought one with you. But we're going to look at 2 Corinthians 4 is the passage we're going to look at together. We're going to start at verse 5. So remember the backdrop. The reason why Paul is writing, because of all of these criticisms that have come against him by these people that are just so used to boasting and being proud and displaying their own strength. Paul's response is this. He says, you see, we don't go around preaching about ourselves. We preach that Jesus Christ is Lord, and we ourselves are your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, let there be light in the darkness, has made this light shine in our hearts so we could know the glory of God that is seen in the face of Jesus Christ. We now have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. This makes it clear that our great power is from God, not from ourselves. We are pressed on every side by troubles, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are hunted down, but never abandoned by God. We get knocked down, but we are not destroyed. Through suffering, our bodies continue to share in the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be seen in our bodies. And just skip to verse 16. And he says, that is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. So we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever. Wow. Paul's response is phenomenal. All of the things he could have said to the Corinthians, or indeed just chosen not to say anything at all in order to be true to himself. But he doesn't do that. What he actually says is, you know, it's not about me. I'm pretty average. In fact, there are some areas in which I'm not very great at all. People are coming against him. And just when he could choose to go back at them or just ignore them altogether, he doesn't choose either. He instead lays himself wide open. And this is what we see in Paul's response. We see Paul remind us that God created everything. In verse 6, it says, God says, let there be light in the darkness. Let there be light in the darkness. That is what God says in the story of creation. God created everything. And that includes you and me. And that is interesting when we think back to what I said about where the word authentic comes from. Because authentic is something that has the authority of its author, of its creator. We have the authority of God. And we were singing his name and his authority earlier on. And Paul here uses the image of the fragile clay jar, something that every home at the time in the first century world would have had. And in the Bible, in Jeremiah 18, it talks about a clay and it talks about the potter's hand. And it says that we are the clay and the potter is God. We are made by God. We are individually, uniquely created by God. And just as every piece of pottery would have the fingerprints of the potter, imagine they're on the wheel making the pottery, would have the fingerprints etched into these individually made fragile clay jars. We too have God's imprint on us. And when you know this, as Paul did, I think we learn three things. The first is this, that we're not to be proud. Paul was one of the most successful church planters ever. He was tireless in sharing Jesus with people. He shared the Bible and shared Jesus and planted churches all across Asia Minor. And then he was the first person to bring the news of Jesus to Europe. And so if anybody deserved to pat themselves on the back and to give themselves a quick compliment, I think Paul probably would be top of that list or near. But actually, he doesn't decide to do that. In the face of criticism, he says that actually it isn't about him at all. It's about Jesus. And in verse 5, he says, we preach that Jesus Christ is Lord. The second thing I think we learn is that we don't have to pretend. Paul heard the insults and the accusations of the Corinthians, and it would have been a chink in his armor. And I think if I was Paul, what I would have done is I would have just taken a moment, readjusted the armor, and then carried on with life. Because we don't like to admit that things are going wrong. We don't like to admit weakness. We don't like to admit when things are difficult. Vulnerability doesn't always come naturally to us. We would rather just pretend that things are okay, brush off the armor, and just carry on. We don't want to let people know what's going on behind the mask sometimes. But in verse 7, Paul describes himself and us as fragile clay jars. Not a golden vase or a priceless trinket box. Actually, what's inside us is valuable, but we are just fragile clay jars. We don't have any other mask. And the third thing I think we learn is that it's okay to not be okay. Paul admits that things are difficult. In verses 8 to 9, he says a list of things. He says he's pressed on every side by troubles, perplexed, hunted, knocked down. However, not only are we not abandoned by God, it says in verse 9, but it is in weakness that God's power meets us. Later on in this same letter, in 2 Corinthians 12, I think it is, Paul quotes something that God has said to him. And he says, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. God's power works best in weakness. It's okay to not be okay because God is powerful. And so being authentic means having the authority of your author. And society tells us that that means being true to yourself, being the author of your own life. But this passage puts a whole new spin on that, because it's God who is our author and our creator. And so it isn't about you, it's about God in you. And that is good news, because it means that we haven't got to do it all by ourselves, and we haven't got to pretend that we have everything together. That is exhausting. But what it does do is it requires something of us. It requires vulnerability. But when you know that you carry the mark of your Creator God, you can take off the mask, you can hand over your fears, and you can embrace all of yourselves, the strengths and the weaknesses. We can be truly authentic. Living authentically requires vulnerability. So let's think practically, what could that look like in our lives? How could we apply this passage and this teaching today? Well, let's start with, what would it look like if we didn't live this way? What would life look like without authenticity? We would believe that we were unbreakable. I don't know if this is for you this evening. We believe we're unbreakable. We'd use all of our strength, all of our own resources, all of our own reserves. We hide parts of ourselves, or we just turn a blind eye to the warning signs. Peter Scazzero, in his book, The Emotionally Healthy Church, says that actually in these situations we do one of three things. We either flee, we fight, or we hide. So we flee, we just bury it, we ignore it, we just numb it, we do anything to avoid recognizing there's an area of weakness or an area where we might need to be vulnerable. Or we fight, we become really angry and we become really bitter. Or we hide it, we just cover it over, we gloss over disappointments, we pretend it isn't happening, we put that mask back on. And I'll give you an example of what that's looked like in my own life. A few years ago, I was in a long-term relationship, and I had been with the person for about 4 years. And for much of that time, I really, really thought that that was the person I was going to spend the rest of my life with. And for a number of reasons, I came to realize that that relationship wasn't right, and I decided to end it. But that didn't make it any less difficult or any less painful. And I was part of the Well at the time, and I think the church was really new, but I was part of a community group here at the Well. And we were a really close-knit community group, and we shared loads about our lives and loads about each other and what we were going through. And yet, as I was going through that breakup and all of the emotions that brings up, all of the questions and all of the angst inside of me, I didn't tell any of them. There were a few people outside of church that I did share with, but actually I mainly just processed by myself and really angrily with God. And I just remember really clearly this point several months later, and as a community group, we were sat in somebody's living room in a circle, and we were going around and we were sharing all of the highs and all of the lows of the previous year and all what God had been doing in our lives. And I told them about this breakup that I had gone through. It had been about 6 months at this point, but I told them that this had happened, and they were shocked because they couldn't believe. They had no idea that under my smile, under my kind of chirpy personality, under the mask that I had been wearing, that had been what I had been going through. That there'd been so much pain under all of that. And I remember at that point in that circle, I felt really proud that I had fooled people. I felt proud that I had managed to keep up that pretense and that they'd never known, they'd never seen that weaker side of me. But that is not a healthy way to be. That was difficult, and that was really, really exhausting. And those were my people, those were my friends. And had I shared at points sooner along the journey, I wonder if actually that would have been a whole lot emotionally easier rather than doing that by myself and pretending that I had everything together. So that is how not to do authenticity and vulnerability. That is not what it's meant to look like. So what does it look like when we live authentically, when we live with vulnerability? What would life look like with it? Well, here are just 6 things that came to mind that I thought were worthy of sharing this evening. The first one is that I think it means acknowledging your weaknesses. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about his thorn in the flesh. And we don't know whether Paul is talking about something physical, he's actually got something physically wrong with him, whether he's talking about something spiritual, whether he's talking about a situation that he faces, but he's very clearly sharing that he's got a weakness, that he's got something that is holding him back, that's making him weaker. And we all have weaknesses. And often it is so much easier to point out other people's weaknesses and other people's flaws than to point out our own. But acknowledging your weaknesses is one of the ways that we can live authentically. The second thing is saying, I don't know. You haven't got to have all the answers. And this is especially important if you are a leader. Because Paul was the leader. He was the guy that planted this church. And yet he led out of a place of weakness. That was the kind of leadership that he showed us. The third one is sharing struggles. I just brought a couple of books that I've been reading recently. So I've just read a book. I'm just going to do some book recommendations here. The Culture Code is fantastic. And also have just been reading a Brené Brown book called Dare to Lead. And the amazing thing that I found when I was reading these books is they had this really common thread. And what they said is that society for so long has been telling us that the way that we are to be vulnerable is once we have built this place of trust. So you build a place where you trust people, you build a place where you know you're safe, and then you take a step and you be vulnerable. But actually what these two books are saying is that actually that's all wrong. We've got it all wrong. We're to turn that on its head. Because once we take that step of vulnerability, which is actually required of us, it builds that place of trust. And so the vulnerability comes before the trust. You have to take that step of faith. So share your struggles. Even if it isn't an already assigned safe place, you'll help make it a place of trust by you being the first person to step out and share that you are struggling. Admitting emotions is the next one. Jesus was emotional. We read it again and again in the Gospels. And so it doesn't matter what your gender is. It doesn't matter whether society tells you you're allowed to be emotional or not. You are allowed to feel. And you're allowed to know what your emotions are. And you're allowed to express them. And so admitting emotions is an important part of being authentic. The fifth one is depending on others. I led a session with a group of female students recently. And I got them on a piece of paper that was cut out like a person to on one side write their strengths and on one side write their weaknesses. And then I got them to go around in the circle and to share with each other their strengths and their weaknesses. And then I got them to pray with each other. And I encouraged them to make that not just stay in the room and not just be a one-off thing they did, but actually to be a way of them recognizing who was strong in certain areas and who needed holding up in this area. And then how did this person's strength link with this person's weakness? And how together could they depend on each other and continue to depend on each other? And so do you have a group like that? Perhaps it's a community here at the Well. Perhaps it's a different group of people. But who can you depend on? And who can you be authentic with to enable that to properly happen? And the last thing is being ready to grow. Being authentic and vulnerable doesn't mean that we encourage people to stay the way they are. God is gracious and God meets us exactly where we need him. But admitting that there are areas that we are weak and that perhaps we need to work on is the first step in a good starting point for change. And so we have all of the grace of Jesus, but it's grace with growth. We have to be ready to grow. And so let me just share with you an example of when I've been a little bit better at some of this stuff, at living an authentic life. It was last year, and my work went through a restructure. And these things happen. Some of you will have experienced this before, but I didn't know what was going to happen, and my job was at risk. And there was a very real chance that I would have to take voluntary redundancy. Now, 4 years ago, I moved 300 miles for the job I'm now in. And so I didn't even know if at the end of all of this, I would even still be in Sheffield. So there was so much uncertainty. And I don't deal very well with uncertainty and not really knowing what is going to happen. And so it was a really difficult time. But unlike my relationship breakdown previously, I decided that I would share what I was going through, that I wouldn't try to do it myself. I wouldn't pretend that the mask I was wearing was really who I am and that I was strong enough to weather all of it. And so I shared with people that were close to me, and I also shared with people in my community here at the Well. I told them what I was facing. I told them how I was feeling. And I asked them, would I be able to depend on them? Would they be able to pray for me? Could all of these things on this list happen in that group of people? Could I be authentic with them? And it was such a healthier way to be and such a healthier way to deal with what life throws at you. It didn't mean that the trouble went away. I still had to go through the process of the restructure. But it meant that actually I could recognize that I could have God's power in my weakness rather than pretending I had everything sorted out. And so it meant that I could process in that way and deal with everything much more healthily, much more emotionally healthily. But living authentically and with vulnerability isn't just about the low times in life. And I think that this is really key. It isn't just about being honest when life throws something really awful at you. It is that. But it's also when life looks really great as well. In the moments that can look like highs too, we also need to live authentically. And so to give you just one final example, I love opportunities like this when I get to speak, and in my job I get to do things like this as well. And I was remembering the other day, an example of a little while ago, a time when I had been speaking, and I was about to do a women's conference, and I was about to speak alongside the Baptist Union president. How exciting. And on the way in the morning, this is a little bit gross, so I'm really sorry about that, but I had been feeling fine. I'd been awake for hours. I had got ready, and I was walking from the hotel to the venue where this conference was about to take place. And all of a sudden, I had to stop on my walk, and this wave of nausea came over me. And I was sick on the side of the road, just out of nowhere, absolutely out of the blue. And it's really unusual for me. And I kind of got to this conference, and I didn't really know what to do with myself because I'd been so sure of what I was going to say and how I was going to be, and I was super confident and probably quite proud, to be honest. But actually, in that moment, and a similar thing happened just the week after. I was about to go live on radio, and something really similar happened to me. But I had to recognize that actually I couldn't do things by myself, even when I thought that I could, and that I had to rely on God. I had to acknowledge my dependency on him. I had to remove any pride that I had and say, actually, it's not about me at all. It's all about Jesus. And I can only do it when I do it with him. And so living authentically is knowing that actually it's not about you. It's about God in you. And authentic means we carry the authority of our author. We carry the authority of God. And so God's power can meet us in our weakness. And that's whether we're in a really low place or a really high place. And I don't know how you are feeling this evening. Maybe you're recognizing that actually you need to relinquish elements of pride like I did. That actually you need to be reminded that it's not about you and it's all about Jesus. Maybe you've been trying to do it your way for a while. You've been trying to wear that mask and pretend that everything's okay and fool people around you. But it's exhausting. You don't have to pretend that you have it all sorted. Or maybe you're just hearing freedom, that actually it's okay not to be okay, and that God's power meets you in your weakness. And so whatever it is that you are hearing tonight, whether you're in a place that feels really high or you're in a place that feels really low, I just pray that you would know that God's power meets you in your weakness, and that we can live authentically when we know that we carry the authority of our author and our creator God in our lives. And sometimes that means vulnerability, but that always means God's power meeting us in our weakness.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Guys, you want to come up as a band? Is Isabel here? Yeah, Isabel, do you want to come in? Just before we sing a final song and we spend just a moment reflecting and asking God what he wants to do in us and how we want to respond, I just want Isabel to come and share some of her story of someone who's walked with authenticity through real struggle, but also in real breakthrough, perhaps in ways that we might not expect. So, share away.
Hi, I'm Isabel. When I was about 14, 15, I started developing quite a lot of muscle pain. It started in my leg and my hip and went onto my back. And I was in really, really chronic pain for about 10, 15 years. Pain was the last thing I thought about before I went to bed, and the first thing I experienced in the morning. On my wedding day, I took 27 pills for the pain and all the side effects of the painkillers. And I was just told that this was going to dominate my life. I was told that I wouldn't be able to work full time, that I would be unable to have children, that I would probably be in a wheelchair by 30. This was just the trajectory that I was told I was going to be on. And it was really painful and difficult. And then kind of 8 years into this pain process, they decided their painkillers weren't good enough, all those drugs I was taking, so instead they put me on a drug called fentanyl.